Some people don't get angry when you lie about them. They get angry when you tell the truth about them too early. There's a strange moment that happens in life that almost nobody talks about openly. It's the moment when you finally say something small, something simple, something calm, and somehow the reaction you get back is louder than the sentence you even spoke. Suddenly, people start over-explaining themselves. Suddenly, they start defending stories nobody accused them of. Suddenly, they start acting like they're standing in a courtroom when all you did was whisper one observation. And that's when you realize something powerful. Your words didn't start the storm, they revealed it. Here's the fact most people never notice. Psychologists have long observed that people react strongest, not when they're attacked, but when their self-image is unexpectedly challenged in front of others. In other words, it's not the volume of what you said that shook them. It was the accuracy of what you noticed. Truth has a way of walking into a room quietly, and somehow leaving footprints everywhere. And what makes this even more surprising, sometimes even a little funny if you step back and watch it happen, is how quickly people try to fix the situation after your sentence lands. One moment they're calm. Next moment they're explaining things nobody asked about, correcting stories nobody mentioned, posting messages nobody requested clarification for. It's like watching someone trip over invisible furniture they themselves placed in the room earlier. That's when you start understanding something deeper about your voice. Your words didn't just travel through the air, they traveled through someone's mask. And once a mask shifts, even slightly, it makes noise. The kind of noise people can't hide. The kind of noise observers notice. The kind of noise that makes someone accidentally reveal more about themselves than they ever planned to. So if you've been wondering why your calm truth created such a loud reaction, why people suddenly started behaving differently after one honest sentence, why some individuals made themselves look uncomfortable trying to explain what didn't even need explaining, then what you're about to hear next will change how you understand the power of your voice forever. Number one, they weren't hurt by your words. They were exposed by them. What really shook them wasn't what you said. It was what your words revealed. There's a big difference between someone being offended and someone being exposed. Offense fades quickly. Exposure stays in the room long after the conversation ends. And deep down, they knew the difference. Most people can handle being criticized. They've practiced defending themselves against criticism their whole lives. They already have excuses ready. They already have explanations prepared. But what they are never ready for is someone calmly pointing out something they hoped nobody had noticed. That's the moment their reaction changes. That's the moment things get uncomfortable. Your words didn't come across like an attack. They came across like recognition. You noticed a pattern they thought was hidden. You spoke about something they thought they were controlling behind the scenes. And when a person realizes they've been seen clearly without permission, something inside them starts scrambling. Not because they hate you, but because they lost control of how they were being perceived. That's why their reaction looked bigger than the situation. It wasn't about one sentence. It was about the fear that others might now start seeing what you saw. Once someone feels their image slipping, they start talking more than usual, explaining more than usual, and sometimes even contradicting themselves without realizing it. In trying to protect themselves, they accidentally draw attention to the very thing they wanted hidden. The truth is, people rarely make noise over something that isn't close to reality. Silence is easy when something doesn't apply to them. But when a statement lands too accurately, even if it's spoken gently, it creates pressure they don't know how to handle. That pressure is what makes them react the way they did. Your words didn't wound them. They removed the cover they were standing behind. And once that cover moved, even a little, everyone else could see what they were trying so hard to keep out of sight. Number Number 2, they thought you were speaking emotionally, but you were speaking observationally. One of the biggest reasons your words shook them is because they expected feelings from you, not clarity. They expected a reaction. They expected frustration, anger, or hurt. What they did not expect was accuracy. And when someone prepares for emotion but receives observation instead, it creates confusion they don't know how to handle. Most people are used to arguments that come from feelings. When someone is emotional, it's easier to dismiss what they're saying. People can say things like, "You're just upset," or "You're overthinking," and quickly move past the moment without taking responsibility. Emotional conversations give them space to escape, but observation doesn't give them that space. Observation is calm, it's steady, it's specific, and that makes it harder to ignore. When you spoke, you weren't trying to win anything. You weren't trying to hurt anyone. You were simply pointing out what you had been quietly noticing over time. That kind of honesty feels different. It doesn't sound loud, but it carries weight. It makes people realize you've been paying attention longer than they assumed. This is where their discomfort started. They thought your silence meant you weren't aware. They thought your patience meant you didn't understand what was happening around you. So when you finally spoke in a clear and direct way, it changed how they saw the situation instantly. They realized you were not reacting in the moment. You had been observing the whole time. And observation removes excuses. It shows patterns instead of one mistake. It connects behavior instead of isolating incidents. Once someone realizes you're not speaking from emotion, but from what you've consistently noticed, they lose the ability to pretend nothing happened. That's why their reaction felt so strong. They weren't responding to feelings. They were responding to the realization that you understood more than they ever expected you to. And once that understanding became visible, they could no longer control the story the way they thought they could. Number 3, their loud reaction proved your quiet accuracy. What made the situation so revealing was not your words alone, but how they responded afterward. Because in many cases, the strongest confirmation of truth is not agreement. It is overreaction. When someone responds louder than the situation requires, it usually means something inside them has already been disturbed. You spoke calmly, and that calmness created space for your words to settle. But instead of addressing what was said directly and simply, they went into overdrive. They started explaining things that were not even questioned. They started defending areas that were not even under attack. And that shift tells its own story. People don't usually react strongly to what they believe is incorrect or irrelevant. They ignore it. They dismiss it. They move on. But when something hits close to reality, it forces them into action. Not thoughtful action, but reactive action. That's when the tone changes, the energy changes, and the behavior becomes inconsistent. What makes it even clearer is how unnecessary their response was compared to your original point. You didn't need to raise your voice. You didn't need to add pressure. You simply stated what you noticed. But they responded as if something bigger had been exposed than what was actually said. That imbalance is important, because when someone is confident in their position, they don't rush to defend it in front of everyone. They remain steady. They let things pass. But when they feel exposed, they begin to overcorrect. They try to reshape perception quickly before others form their own understanding. In doing that, they end up revealing more than they intended. The urgency in their response becomes evidence itself. The need to control how others interpret your words becomes louder than your actual statement. And that is what confirmed everything without you needing to add anything else. Your calm words didn't just land, they stayed, and their reaction didn't erase them. it only highlighted them. Number 4, they mocked what they secretly feared was correct. Mockery is rarely as innocent as it looks. On the surface, it seems like confidence, like someone brushing off what was said. But in many real situations, it is actually a quick escape route when a person feels something they heard might be true, but they are not ready to face it directly. So instead of sitting with it, they turn it into a joke, hoping it loses power. What makes this even more obvious is the timing. People don't usually mock things that feel irrelevant to them. They mock things that touch a sensitive point, but make them uncomfortable. Because if something truly meant nothing, there would be no need to react at all. Silence would be enough. But mockery shows engagement. It shows that something landed, even if they refuse to admit it openly. When your words reached them, they didn't respond with calm correction or clear disagreement. They shifted into ridicule. That shift is important. It often means the message hit closer than they expected. Instead of dealing with the content of what was said, they tried to reduce its weight by making it look silly or exaggerated. But here's what usually happens in moments like this. The attempt to mock doesn't erase the message. It actually keeps it alive longer. Because now others are paying attention not just to what was said, but to why it triggered such a reaction. And the more energy someone puts into dismissing something, the more it stands out. Deep down, mockery can also come from discomfort. Not the kind that is loud or dramatic, but the kind that sits quietly in the background. A part of them recognizes a possibility they don't want to confirm. So instead of exploring it, they push it away with humor or sarcasm. But the truth doesn't disappear just because it was laughed at. If anything, the need to laugh at it so quickly often shows it wasn't as harmless as they wanted it to seem. Number 5, your timing disturbed them more than your message. What unsettled them wasn't just what you said, but when you said it. Timing carries weight in human behavior more than most people realize. The same words can be ignored in one moment and become uncomfortable in another, depending on what stage people are in, emotionally, socially, or mentally. And in your case, your timing didn't match what they were prepared for. They had a version of the story already forming in their minds, a version where things stayed unspoken, a version where their actions remained unchallenged, a version where they could continue behaving a certain way without interruption. That quiet assumption gave them comfort. It allowed them to move freely without feeling seen in ways they didn't expect. But your words entered at a point where that comfort was still active. You didn't wait for a convenient moment for them. You didn't wait for them to be ready or prepared. You simply spoke when you noticed something that needed to be said. And that alone changed the atmosphere. When truth arrives earlier than someone's internal readiness, it creates disruption. Not because the truth is wrong, but because it interrupts the narrative they were still building. It forces them to deal with something they hadn't finished processing in private. And most people prefer to control when they face themselves. That is why their reaction felt so strong. It wasn't just about disagreement. It was about interruption. You stepped into a moment they thought they still owned, a moment where they were not expecting accountability, reflection, or exposure. And when people are interrupted in their internal storyline, they often respond emotionally rather than logically. They rush to protect their position, explain themselves quickly, or shift attention away from the original point. Not because the message is unclear, but because the timing didn't give them space to prepare their usual defenses. In the end, what disturbed them most wasn't your message alone. It was the fact that it arrived before they were ready to pretend it wasn't true. Number 6, they tried to turn you into the problem because they couldn't fix the reality you described. When people hear something they can't easily challenge, they often switch direction, instead of addressing it directly. Rather than dealing with the actual point, they shift focus onto the person who said it. This is not because the message is unclear, but because the message is uncomfortable to handle without losing control of the situation. So instead of saying, "That's not true," or calmly explaining their side, they start changing the subject. Suddenly the focus is no longer on what was said, but on who said it. Your tone becomes the issue. Your character becomes the issue. Your timing becomes the issue. Everything except the actual point starts getting attention. This is a common move when someone feels they cannot easily correct what has been noticed about them. If the reality being described is too close to the truth, arguing against it directly can sometimes make it worse for them. So they try another approach: discredit the source. By making you the problem, they attempt to reduce the weight of your words. If they can make others question your intention, then they can avoid fully engaging with what was actually pointed out. It becomes less about truth and more about perception management. But this shift often reveals more than it hides. Because when someone is confident in their position, they stay focused on the content. They don't need to attack the speaker to defend their reality. They can simply respond to what was said. But when the response quickly turns personal, it often shows that the original message hit something sensitive. What makes it even more obvious is how unnecessary the reaction becomes. Instead of addressing a specific point, they expand the conversation into your personality, your motives, or your understanding. That expansion is not random. It is a distraction strategy, even if they don't consciously realize it. In the end, the attempt to make you the issue does not erase the reality you pointed out. It only shows that dealing with the message itself felt harder than shifting attention away from it. Number 7. They exposed their insecurity by explaining themselves to people who never asked. One of the clearest signs that someone has been emotionally affected by your words is what they do after the moment has passed. It's not always in the direct conversation. It shows up in what they start doing around other people who weren't even part of the situation. That's where things become interesting. Instead of letting the moment stay where it happened, they begin carrying it around. They replay it in their minds, then try to fix it outside the original setting. So they start explaining themselves to friends, random people, or anyone willing to listen. But the key detail is this: nobody asked them to explain anything. That alone tells a story. People who are fully secure in themselves don't rush to clear their name when nothing has truly damaged it. They don't feel the need to rebuild an image that wasn't actually destroyed. But when insecurity is triggered, even slightly, it creates a strong urge to regain control of how they are seen. And one of the fastest ways people try to do that is through over-explaining. What makes this even more noticeable is how much energy they put into it. They don't just mention it once and move on. They repeat it. They emphasize certain parts. They try to frame themselves in a better light. And in doing so, they often say more than they needed to, which ends up drawing even more attention to the situation. At the same time, they assume others are thinking about it as much as they are. But most people aren't. That gap between perception and reality is what causes them to overshare. They are reacting to internal pressure, not external demand. And while they believe they are fixing their image, what actually happens is the opposite. The effort to control how they are seen makes the situation more visible. Their urgency becomes noticeable. Their explanations become louder than necessary. And without realizing it, they begin confirming that your words did not simply pass through unnoticed. They stayed with them longer than expected. Number 8. Your calmness made their reaction look exaggerated. There is something powerful about remaining calm when tension rises. Not the kind of calmness that is performative, but the kind that simply doesn't rush to match chaos. In moments like that, people often don't realize how much their own behavior is being measured against yours. And that comparison alone changes how everything is perceived. When you stayed steady in your words and tone, it created contrast. And contrast reveals things people usually hide. Their reaction started to stand out more than the situation itself. Not because you said more, but because they did. Not because you escalated anything, but because they did. In human behavior, people often assume the loudest voice controls the story. But in reality, it's often the balance between calm and reaction that shapes how others interpret what is happening. When one side remains composed and the other becomes visibly reactive, the difference becomes hard to ignore. That's what made their response look heavier than it actually needed to be. They may have thought they were simply defending themselves or clarifying something. But from the outside, the intensity didn't match the original statement. It felt like more energy was being used than the situation required. And when that happens, observers naturally start to question why. Not necessarily what was said, but why it caused such a strong emotional shift. Because calm doesn't demand attention, but overreaction always does. It pulls focus without trying. Your calmness didn't need explanation. It didn't need reinforcement. It stood on its own. And because of that, it made everything around it more visible. Their urgency, their tone, their effort to respond quickly. All of it became easier to notice. What they didn't realize is that calmness doesn't just reduce noise, it highlights it. And in that contrast, their reaction didn't just exist, it stood out. Number 9. They underestimated how closely you had been watching them. What caught them off guard wasn't just what you said, but the fact that you were able to say it with precision. People often assume that if someone is quiet, they are not paying attention. They confuse silence with absence. They confuse patience with ignorance. That assumption is where they miscalculated everything. You were not reacting in a rushed or emotional way. You were observing over time. That kind of observation is different from surface-level noticing. It builds slowly, it collects patterns, it remembers behavior that others think gets overlooked. So when you finally spoke, it didn't come from a single moment. It came from many moments quietly connecting in the background. That is why your words felt sharper than they expected. They were not based on guesswork. They were not based on assumptions. They were based on consistency. And consistency is hard to argue against because it doesn't rely on emotion. It relies on repetition. They thought your silence meant you were unaware. They thought your calmness meant you were not tracking what was happening. But in reality, you were seeing more than they assumed, just without announcing it. That created a gap between what they believed about you and what was actually true. When that gap finally closed through your words, it created discomfort, because it revealed that things they thought were unnoticed had actually been noticed all along. And once people realize their behavior has been observed more carefully than expected, they start to reassess how they acted in the first place. What made it even more impactful is that you didn't need to exaggerate anything. You didn't need to add emotion to make your point stronger. The accuracy itself carried weight, and accuracy has a way of landing differently compared to opinion. They underestimated your attention, and that misjudgment shaped their reaction. Because once someone realizes they were being observed more closely than they thought, they start questioning not just what you said, but how much you already understood before you ever spoke. Number 10. They tried to rewrite the moment after realizing they lost control of it. Once a moment exposes something uncomfortable, people rarely accept it as it is. The first instinct is often not reflection, but correction of the story. Not correction of behavior, but correction of how the moment will be remembered. Because memory, in social situations, becomes a kind of currency people try to influence. After your words landed, something shifted in how they saw the situation. It was no longer just a private exchange. It became something that could be interpreted by others. And that is when the rewriting begins. They start adjusting details in conversations, changing emphasis, and reframing what was said so it sounds less impactful than it actually was. But this rewriting is not random. It usually happens when someone realizes they didn't control the outcome of a moment the way they expected to. When that control slips, even slightly, there is a strong urge to regain it by reshaping the narrative afterward. So they begin to say things like, "It wasn't that serious," or "It was taken the wrong way," or "It was just a misunderstanding." Not always because those statements are fully accurate, but because they help soften the impact of what others might have noticed. It becomes less about truth and more about damage control. The interesting part is that this process often makes the original moment more noticeable, not less. Because when people feel the need to repeatedly explain or minimize something, it draws attention back to it. The effort to reduce importance ends up highlighting importance. And in trying to adjust how the moment is remembered, they reveal that it mattered more to them than they want to admit. If it truly had no effect, there would be no need to rewrite it. It would simply pass. But it didn't pass. It stayed. And that lingering effect is what pushed them to reshape it after the fact, hoping that changing the story would change how it felt. Number 11. Your words forced them to confront the version of themselves they avoid privately. What made your words land so heavily wasn't just what you said, but what it reflected back at them. People can ignore opinions, and they can dismiss criticism, but it becomes much harder when what they hear feels connected to something they already sense about themselves in private. That's where discomfort begins. Most people carry two versions of themselves. One version they show to the world and another version they quietly deal with when no one is watching. The private version is where doubts, insecurities, and self-awareness sit without filters. It is not always spoken about, but it is always there in the background. When your words came, they didn't create something new. They activated something already existing. That is why the reaction felt stronger than expected. It was not about learning something unfamiliar. It was about being reminded of something they had been trying to manage internally. People are often comfortable avoiding that inner version of themselves because it stays unspoken. As long as it remains private, it feels manageable. But when someone outside reflects even a small part of it accurately, it becomes harder to ignore. Not because the truth is harsh, but because it feels familiar. That familiarity is what creates tension. It removes the comfort of denial. It brings internal thoughts into external space, and once something internal feels visible, people start reacting differently. Not always logically, but emotionally, because they feel seen in a way they didn't plan for. They may not admit it openly, but part of their reaction comes from that internal confrontation. Your words didn't invent a problem. They exposed something already sitting beneath their behavior. And that is why it stayed with them longer than they expected. Because when someone is forced to face the version of themselves they usually avoid, even briefly, it creates a pressure that doesn't disappear quickly. It lingers, not because of what was said alone, but because of what it revealed inside them. Number 12. They embarrassed themselves trying to prove they weren't embarrassed. What makes certain reactions stand out isn't the original situation, but what people do afterward to recover from it. When someone feels exposed, even slightly, they often don't sit with it quietly. Instead, they rush into action to fix how they are being seen. But in that rush, they usually reveal more than they intended to hide. After your words landed, The shift didn't happen in silence. It happened in behavior. They started acting in ways that looked less like calm response and more like overcompensation. The need to appear unaffected became the very thing that made it obvious they were affected. Instead of letting the moment settle naturally, they tried to correct the perception quickly. They spoke more than necessary. They emphasized points that didn't need emphasis. They tried to appear relaxed while clearly putting effort into appearing relaxed. And that effort is what gave everything away. When someone is truly unbothered, there is no performance attached to it. But when someone is trying to prove they are unbothered, the performance becomes noticeable. Small inconsistencies begin to show. The tone doesn't match the message. The timing feels forced. The explanations become slightly too detailed. What they didn't realize is that the audience always picks up on effort. People can usually tell when something is natural and when something is being managed. And in trying to control how they looked after your words, they ended up drawing more attention to themselves than the original moment ever did. The irony is that the attempt to avoid embarrassment became the source of it, because instead of letting the situation pass, they kept interacting with it. And every interaction added more visibility to what they were trying to downplay. In trying to prove they were not shaken, they revealed exactly where the pressure was. And that is how a simple reaction turned into something more noticeable than the moment they were trying to escape. Number 13. Your restraint made their reaction look like confession. One of the most misunderstood strengths in human interaction is restraint. Not silence for effect, not avoidance, but simply not matching chaos with chaos. When you chose not to escalate, not to overreact, and not to chase validation in the moment, it created a contrast that became impossible to ignore. People often expect conflict to feel balanced. If one side gets emotional, they expect the other side to follow. It makes the situation feel symmetrical in their minds. But when one person stays steady, something changes. The imbalance becomes visible. And in that visibility, the stronger reaction starts to look less like strength and more like exposure. Your restraint didn't remove tension, it highlighted it. Because while they were reacting, explaining, or trying to defend themselves, you weren't feeding the cycle. You weren't adding fuel. You were simply holding your position without turning it into a performance. That lack of performance is what made everything else stand out. Their urgency became more noticeable. Their need to respond quickly became more obvious. Even the way they tried to justify themselves started to look like they were reacting to something deeper than just your words. What people don't always realize is that restraint forces others to sit with their own energy. When there's no escalation to hide behind, their reaction becomes more visible in its raw form. And raw reactions often say more than carefully chosen words ever could. That is why it started to feel like confession without anyone intending it that way. Not because they admitted anything directly, but because their behavior began revealing pressure points they were trying to control. The contrast between your calm and their urgency made the difference impossible to miss. In the end, your restraint didn't just keep you grounded. It exposed how ungrounded their response had become. And that shift is what made the situation speak louder than either side's words alone. Number 14. The real reason your words cut them so deeply is because they knew you weren't trying to hurt them. What made everything land so heavily was not aggression, not insult, and not loud confrontation. It was the absence of all that. Your words didn't come from a place of trying to win or destroy. They came from a place of clarity. And clarity hits differently when people are used to dealing with emotion, drama, or exaggeration. Most people can prepare for attack. They can defend themselves against someone who is clearly angry or trying to prove a point. but they are far less prepared for someone who is simply stating what they noticed without emotional pressure attached. That kind of honesty doesn't give them anything easy to push back against. Because when someone is trying to hurt you, you can label it. You can dismiss it as bitterness or frustration. But when someone is not trying to hurt you and still points something out that feels accurate, it removes those easy labels. It forces a different kind of reflection. That is where the discomfort begins. Not because the message is loud, but because it is clean. There is no obvious angle to attack. There is no emotional overreach to discredit. There is just observation. And observation has a way of sticking longer than opinion. What made it even more intense for them is the feeling that you weren't benefiting from the situation emotionally. You weren't trying to dominate the moment. You weren't seeking validation through the reaction. You were simply stating what you saw and moving on from it internally. That removes a lot of their usual defenses, because when there is no obvious emotional intent to fight against, they are left with the message itself. And if that message reflects something real, even partially, it becomes harder to shake off. In the end, it wasn't your intention that cut deep. It was the lack of bad intention. That is what made your words harder to dismiss, harder to twist, and harder for them to forget. What ties everything together is simple, even if it doesn't feel simple in the moment. Your words didn't gain power because they were loud, emotional, or dramatic. They gained power because they were accurate, calm, and untouchable. And when truth shows up like that, it doesn't need to chase attention. It naturally exposes what was already unstable. Across everything that unfolded, one pattern keeps repeating. People didn't react strongly because you attacked them. They reacted strongly because something in your words removed their ability to stay hidden behind excuses, assumptions, or carefully built images. And when that protection disappears, even for a moment, people start responding in ways that don't always match the situation. They over-explain. They overreact. They try to shift attention. They try to rewrite meaning. Not because the truth is confusing, but because it is too clear to ignore comfortably. What makes this even more interesting is that your strength wasn't in how much you said, but in how little you needed to do beyond simply speaking honestly. No chasing, no forcing, no emotional collapse, just clarity. And that clarity created contrast. It made reactions louder. It made intentions visible. It made hidden insecurities surface without you having to dig for them. In the end, this isn't really about conflict at all. It's about perception. It's about how people respond when they realize they've been seen more accurately than they expected. And it's about how truth, when delivered without noise, often becomes the loudest thing in the room without trying. So take this as the deeper message running through everything. You don't need to exaggerate truth for it to land. You don't need to force reactions for truth to matter. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply speak clearly and stay steady while reality does the rest. If this resonated with you and you want more deep, brutally honest content like this, then don't just pass by. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's next. Like the video if it hit home for you, comment your thoughts because your voice matters here, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. It might be exactly what they've been avoiding, but need to understand. Stay blessed always.